Good afternoon and welcome to our first session of our International Student Focused Political Webinar Series hosted by International Student and Scholar Services. My name is Chelsea Wells and I am the Director of ISSS. This political webinar series will be composed of 4 weekly sessions throughout the month of October leading up to the US presidential election on November 3rd. The purpose of this webinar series is to provide international students and non-US citizens with a foundational context for discussions around the US presidential election, and also to provide information to students about how to engage safely in the political process and political activism, particularly as a non-US citizen. You can find out more information about our political webinar series this month, as well as upcoming sessions by going to the ISSS website at isss.utah.edu. If you're interested in attending future sessions, please do not forget to register for these events through our website. Our first session today is focused on the basics of the US political system. Before we get started, we would like to conduct a quick poll so that we have an idea of how familiar you are with this topic. Throughout the discussion today, we hope to provide information about the general structure of the US federal government, the history of the two-party system in the United States, the role of individual states and what their role is in the election process and how it impacts the outcome of this national elective office, and then finally, the impact of the role of race and racial inequity in the US election process. We have a distinguished panel of experts joining us today. Our panelists include Dr. Juliette Carlisle, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Dr. James Curry, Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies, Department of Political Science, Dr. Matthew Burbank, Professor, Department of Political Science, and then Dr. Edmund Fung, Associate Professor, Chair, Division of Ethnic Studies and Department of Political Science. We thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion. If you experience any technical difficulties during this webinar session, please email the ISSS tech inbox. The email address will be posted in the chat for your reference. If you have any questions, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We ask that you do not use the chat feature for this webinar session. I will be reading your questions aloud to the panelists during the question and answer portion of our session at the end. And after today's session, we will also be posting a recording on our website, and we'll also add additional information and resources to provide further information about these topics. Before we begin with our panelists, you see the results of our poll. It looks like we have all of our results up here. It looks like most people are either not familiar or only somewhat familiar, so that's good. It provides a good context for today's discussion. All right, so we can go ahead and get started now, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Juliette Carlisle as our first panelist, and she will be speaking about the US federal government structure.
All right, hi everybody. Thank you for tuning in, and I'm just going to set my timer and talk to you about the structure of the American government system. I teach this a lot in my undergraduate class, and it usually spans a few different class periods, and so I'm trying to smush it down for you. Basically, I'm going to cover 3 broad topics. I'm going to cover the history and context of the Constitution. I'm going to talk about the Constitution itself and the component parts of it, and then talk a little bit more specifically about federalism. And so one thing that's really important to know about the history of the United States and the structure of government is that when it was a colony, obviously it was under the power of a foreign government, and the American framers really didn't want to replicate a government that had a strong central government. What they really wanted was to empower the states more than they had been previously. And so when they first drafted what we call the Articles of Confederation during the Revolutionary War, this sort of served as the part of the framework. It was a really weak central government, again, in part to sort of rebel against this notion of a really strong central power, a strong central government. But what was discovered was that it's really hard to operate especially a great number of states, or colonies at that time, but states, with that all had their own powers, you know, the power to print money, the power to manage their ports. And so they were all acting sort of like their own little nation states, and that became very complicated. So when it was sort of, you know, discovered that this was not really going to work as a structure of government, they went back to the drawing board, and in 1787, during the Constitutional Convention, considered a lot of how they're going to structure this. And so a couple of basic plans came about. One is the Virginia plan, and one is the New Jersey plan. And these were plans that really sort of emphasized different components of the government. You know, whether we're going to have a bicameral, meaning a two-house legislature, the number of executives, you know, like presidents, and how long they would serve, how many terms that they could serve, the role of the judiciary, and so forth. And so a lot of these were sort of hatched out in a couple of different plans. And ultimately, what we had was the result of a compromise. And we call it the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. And this really sort of merged some of the components of each together, of each of the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan together. And so what we actually got, like I tell my students all the time, politics is the result of compromise. What we got is really what nobody ultimately wanted, but it took elements of these different plans. Part of the compromise included the Electoral College. I'm not going to go into that because I think somebody else is covering that in this webinar today. But a couple of basic principles that are really the foundation of the American Constitution is the idea of republicanism. So this is a form of government in which power resides in the people and is exercised through their electoral representatives. So in the American system, we don't have a direct democracy. We oftentimes make decisions by electing people who vote or preference their, hopefully represent our preferences in Congress and pass laws that correlate with their constituents. We also have this idea of federalism. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about federalism, but this is basically the idea that we have power vested in not only this central federal government, but also in regional governments. So in the United States, we have 50 state governments, and then we have localities, local governments, county governments, city governments. And a lot of times these lower level of government operate in coordination with the state. Sometimes there's a little bit more independence that they have. But again, there's this power shared at two different levels. And the idea is just really to moderate sort of the winds of change and to sort of make it so any sort of change, political change, comes about particularly slow and in a clunky manner. That was really important to the founders. We also have this idea of separation of powers. And you've probably heard about that in your familiarization with American government. And this is really the assignment of lawmaking, law enforcing, and law interpreting functions to different separate branches of government. And we also have another basic principle of our government is checks and balances. And this is a government structure that gives some sort of authority of certain branches over other branches of government. So for example, a president can nominate a judicial member of the Supreme Court, but that has to be voted on and approved by the Senate. So there's some sort of power that is shared. It's really separate institutions sharing power. So with the articles of the Constitution, a couple of the, or a few of the primary articles deal with each of these branches. So the first article is the legislative article. And it's really by no mistake that this is the first article. So again, the American founders, the founders of the US, really wanted to possess power in the role of the people. It was really important that the people maintain the power. And the people maintain the power through the legislature. And so that's the first article. It's not the executive article. And so this really establishes the powers of Congress, the limited powers of Congress. It describes the operating procedures. It discusses the enumerated powers. These are the powers explicitly given to Congress by the Constitution. And it also talks about the necessary and proper clause. And in an American government, this is actually a really important clause. This is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and you may not remember that. But the necessary and proper clause is really what political scientists like to call the elastic clause, because it's a clause that can be stretched and stretch the power of the federal government beyond what is expressly enumerated to them. And so in some ways, although the federal government, Congress, technically doesn't have the power to make, say, environmental laws, right, to pass environmental laws, to regulate the environment. Through the interpretation of the elastic clause, this is how we get environmental legislation, because Congress has the right to regulate commerce, and businesses are part of commerce. And so, the clause is stretched. The second article, this is where you find the executive article, and this establishes, again, the powers of the president, the terms of office, the presidential duties and power. You know, the president is commander-in-chief, is in charge of making treaties, appointing government officers, diplomats, judges, and so forth. Now, the balance of power, I should say really quickly, between the Congress and the president has certainly evolved over time. So that's important to acknowledge in American political history, that Congress has ceded some of its power to the president. I'm going to quickly, I know I'm probably at time here. I'm going to quickly talk a little bit about federalism a little bit more specifically. Just give me like 2 minutes and I'll finish up. Federalism, if we think about countries like the UK, for example, they have the unitary system of government, and our system of government is different. In a unitary system of government, power is possessed in one single unit. But as I said before, we have a federalist system. So we have power that's dispersed from the federal government to the state government to the localities. And one reason why we have this in our system is just a basic result of history, that we started from 13, well, colonies, but colonies, you know, easily evolved into states. So there's a political history to this. And the articles of the Constitution that follow, Articles 6 and Amendment 10 of the amendments, talk about this dispersion of power between the two levels of government. And then the last thing I should say is that what we also see in American political history is that federalism itself and our understanding about which power dominates, whether it's the federal government or lower level state governments, has sort of changed and evolved over time. Early on in American history, it was really distinct what powers were possessed by the federal government and what powers were possessed by the state government. But as problems and history has evolved, we have found that the federal government and state government have intertwined a lot more. They work oftentimes in partnership through funding arrangements to pass policies and regulations and so forth. But that has sort of, changed a little bit throughout history. I know that's a really quick introduction, and I hope I've given it justice. And if you have any questions, please holler.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carlisle. If you do have any questions, those of you in the audience, please just remember to submit those through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer those at the end. Our next panelist, unfortunately, was not able to join us this afternoon due to a scheduling conflict, but he was kind enough to send us a pre-recording of his lecture. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and so you can see that lecture on. And this is about the history of the two-party system in the United States. Sorry about that. Let me try one more time. It looks like there was just a little bit of a sound issue.
Hi everyone, my name is Jim Curry. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Utah. I'm sorry I can't be with you all today to talk about the U.S. two-party system, so I was asked to record a brief lecture about the topic. But please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions you might have about the U.S. two-party system or just to chat more about the subject. This is a really rich and complex topic. There's a lot we could discuss, but today I'm just going to give a quick overview. So what I'm going to do today is really focus on three broad questions about the two-party system. First, I'm going to tell you what is it? What is the U.S. two-party system? Then I'm going to answer the question of why do we have it? Why do we have a two-party system in the U.S. instead of some other form of party system? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why it matters, or what are the consequences that the two-party system has for our broader politics and policymaking. So first, just this, what is the two-party system? Simply put, a two-party system means that the U.S. has just two major parties that are stable and which are competitive and which compete for office and policy gains throughout the government and across the country. Now, importantly, this differs significantly from a lot of other countries. This map gives a rough guide to the different kinds of party systems that exist throughout the world. Essentially, they've color-coded different systems from where they have no data to where there's a one-party system, a two-party system, or multi-party systems. Those in the green or tealish color are those countries that have what most people consider multi-party systems. That is, they have three or more competitive parties. The orange countries are essentially non-democracies that have just one party running the show. And in purple are the relatively fewer number of countries that have a two-party system. This includes the U.S. In these countries, there are usually just two parties that are considered major and that are fairly stable over time. Now, how do we know that the U.S. has just two major parties? I mean, after all, there are other parties in the United States. There's the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, There's all sorts of other parties that actually exist throughout the country. And if you look at a ballot in the United States, especially for a major office, there aren't just two options on there. There tend to be a half dozen or so. Well, we know a major party when we see one because it is a party that is consistently competitive and stable and is so throughout the country, and especially at the national level. That is, major parties seek important political office on a consistent basis or put forward candidates for those offices. They are competitive for those offices most of the time and in most places throughout the country. And they do so election after election after election in year after year after year. In the United States, those two major parties are the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. These are clearly the only two parties that meet the definition of major parties in the United States. In fact, these two parties have won nearly every national and federal office that's been up for grabs since the 1850s. Democrats and Republicans have won every single presidential election in the United States since 1852. They've held more than 95% of all the seats in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate since the Civil War. And they continue to be competitive at every level and for every office, especially national office, all throughout that period. Again, other parties exist for sure, but these parties tend to be very minor. They tend to be either temporary or regionally based or uncompetitive, and sometimes all three. To be sure, third parties have made a splash in U.S. politics before, but they almost never win. They also tend to be short-lived, being built by usually a particularly charismatic and usually presidential candidate, but then fading once that candidate retires from national office. One of the most recent examples was the Reform Party, which was formed out of the success of Ross Perot's third-party candidacy for the presidency in 1992. And you can see that early on, Ross Perot and the Reform Party did well. It did well when Ross Perot ran initially in 1992, where he won 18.9% of the popular vote in that presidential election. When he ran again 4 years later under the Reform Party ticket, he still did quite well by U.S. standards for a third-party candidate, winning 8.4% of the vote. But then Ross Perot effectively retired from politics, turned over his party to others, and from there, it largely faded away. They've won some regional or state-level offices, or occasionally a local office, but even in 2000, the first presidential election right after Ross Perot's retirement from politics, it won just 0.4% of the two-party vote, and it really has never recovered. Another example is George Wallace and his American Independent Party. This is a party that was largely a Southern white segregationist party, which formed out of discontent with the Democratic Party's embrace of civil rights in the 1960s. And in 1968, George Wallace ran as a very charismatic, populist candidate on that ticket and won 13.5% of the vote. He may have cost Hubert Humphrey the presidential election, who was Hubert Humphrey being the Democratic Party nominee of that year. But when George Wallace didn't run for president and again in 1972 for various reasons, and other people are nominated, you can see how quickly things fall off. In 1972, the American Independent Party, which had won a substantial share of the vote in 1968, just got 1.4% of the vote, and by 1976 the party had split and was defunct. Another famous example would be Teddy Roosevelt and his Bull Moose Party, which later became called the Progressive Party. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt ran on this ticket, a party he had created in his own image, and won 27.4% of the vote, actually coming in second place as a third-party candidate in a presidential election in the United States. However, in 1916, when TR chose not to run and in fact dropped out of the race, they didn't even put forward a presidential candidate, and by 1920, the party was largely defunct. So we have two parties in the U.S., but why does the U.S. have a two-party system? We are often told that the country's party system formed despite the Founding Fathers' skepticism of parties. And that's true. We can see that in their words. We can see the words of the founders showing skepticism of the political parties. James Madison, for instance, warned of the dangers of parties by calling them the mischiefs of faction and saying that this sort of problem of faction or partisanship means that any number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. In other words, James Madison and others saw parties as essentially working against what they saw as the common good or the public interest and could be a danger to a mass democracy. George Washington certainly didn't like political parties very much, which is born out of his own experience as president. And Washington expressed his distaste for partisanship in his farewell address to the presidency, saying, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, is itself a frightful despotism." But any high-minded dreams of the founders fell to political reality very quickly in the new U.S. Republic. Parties, after all, are a natural state in mass democracies. They exist in every mass democracy in the world. In fact, they existed in most political systems at the time of the U.S. Revolution. Political parties organize voters, they organize candidates, they organize governmental officials, and help them engage in the collective enterprises of electioneering and lawmaking. But why do we have just two parties in the U.S.? Is it because of corruption? Is it because of certain politicians trying to hold on to power and pushing out other ideas? No, not quite. There is a simple political science principle called Duverger's law that nicely explains why the United States and some other countries have just two parties, while other countries have more. Under Duverger's law, the expectation is that countries that have plurality, winner-take-all elections, have two-party systems. That is, where we have an election system where candidates run and the candidate that gets the most votes wins the only seat up for grabs in that election. Those types of electoral systems tend to lead to countries that have just two parties. Countries, on the other hand, that may have more proportional systems or proportional winner elections, where people show up and they vote for candidates or they vote for parties, and perhaps if you win 40% of the vote, you get 40% of the seats in the legislature, and if you have 20% of the vote in that election, you get 20% of the seats in the legislature. Countries that have systems like that tend to have multiple parties. That's because when you have a plurality or majority of the vote necessarily to win a single seat in any election, or to win the chief executive office in a country, what this causes is that different political factions, which may have formed their own parties otherwise, but have some similarities, combine their forces and work together to try to get to that plurality or the majority of the vote in the election, especially over other political factions which they may find more distasteful or with whom they disagree with more. The danger is if these semi-like-minded factions split into multiple parties, they will lose every election if the other side coalesces. The U.S. system reinforces this logic over and over again because we have single winner, plurality winner type elections at almost every level of our government. We have single winner seats to win seats in the House of Representatives. We have single winner elections to win seats in the Senate. We have a single winner race to win the presidency and the White House.
All right. We would like to sincerely thank Dr. Curry for taking the time to create this pre-recording and share it with us for our discussion this afternoon. We did have to cut the lectures a little bit short due to time constraints, but we will be posting this video on our website afterwards so that you can view all of it. Our next topic is about the complexity of the US presidential election and what role the individual states play in determining the outcome of this national elective office. So I'm excited to welcome our next panelist, Dr. Matthew Burbank, to speak about this topic.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be able to talk about this a little bit. And what I want to do is talk about some of the things that Professor Carlisle just mentioned, as well as some of the things that Professor Curry just mentioned. Right. So Professor Carlisle noted that when we think about American government, right, we often focus on the presidency, even though the executive is the second article and the legislative is the first article, right? We often focus on the presidential election because it is the one national election that we have in the United States. And so what comes out of that is a sense that that is, the important election. And as Professor Curry just pointed out in terms of thinking about the nature of the party system, certainly for the political parties, this is the big prize, right? Winning the presidency is the big prize. And so what we have with presidential elections then is a heavy focus on the executive. But one of the things that is complex about the United States, and again, Professor Carlisle pointed this out in her discussion about federalism, is that it seems like this is a national election really between two political parties. So it ought to be as simple as saying you have two choices, pick one, and everybody in the United States who's eligible to vote would get a ballot and pick one of those two people. And that would be nice in a way, but in fact, our American system doesn't work that way at all. In fact, the way the American system works is that elections are actually conducted by states, right? There is no federally carried out election. So even though we're voting on a federal office for the presidential election, in fact, the elections are conducted entirely by the states. And this comes out of the federal power that Professor Carlisle was talking about, right? That one of the things that states do is they run their own elections. And of course, this makes sense because they're going to be having elections for governors and for state representatives and for local officials as well. And so it makes sense for those local areas to run their own elections. But in fact, there is no kind of federal equivalent of that at the presidential level, right? So the presidential elections are indeed conducted by the states. And what this means then is that it's not as simple as saying, here are two parties, they each have nominees, pick one, because in fact, the states set the rules for who gets to be on the ballot. The states set the rules for who's eligible to vote in a state, and the states set the rules for kind of the timing and the structure of the elections. So one of the things that we've heard in this presidential election, if you've been paying attention at all, one of the debates you might have heard in the United States is this question about mail-in ballots and are they safe and can they be done and are they full of fraud and all these terrible things going to happen if we have mail-in elections. And it turns out that, again, that's not a question for the federal government to answer because the federal government doesn't get to control that, right? It's really a question for the states. And so what we have are some states, such as Utah, for example, which has been conducting its elections by mail for a number of years. And we have other states that don't really conduct their elections by mail, except, for example, with absentee ballots. And so what we have in our federal system in the United States then is a great deal of complexity because states get to set their own rules for elections. And that means that indeed there is not just one presidential ballot, there are in fact 50 presidential ballots. And indeed, if you count Washington, D.C., which you should, there are actually 51 presidential ballots. Right? And so each one gets to set their own structure there. So what I want to note here is just that when we're talking about presidential elections, is that we're really talking about a range of important actors. We just mentioned the important role that state governments have. And again, Professor Curry pointed out the role that the two major parties have. And so again, generally when we think about presidential elections, what we're looking at is we're thinking about kind of the choice between the Republican and the Democratic candidate, because as Professor Curry pointed out, right, in most cases, right, that's who's going to win the election. But we also want to recognize that those are not necessarily the only people who are on the ballot. If, for example, you were to look at Utah's ballot for this presidential election, you'll see that there are going to be 6 or 7 possible choices there. In other states, there are going to be other choices there as well. So one of the things to keep in mind is that while Republicans and Democrats appear on all state ballots, and there are a couple of reasons for that, but they appear on all state ballots, but it's also true that the state ballots differ, right? So who actually is listed as a presidential candidate on any of those states is going to depend upon which state you're in. So depending upon where you're voting, you're going to see ballots that are going to look different. The other point I should note here is, along with the national political parties and the states, those are two big actors in terms of what presidential elections look like. There are also state laws are important, and so state legislators are important, and state elected officials are important, and state election officials are important. Right? So there are a whole range of people who are taking part in this process And that's one of the reasons why the US system is far more complex than it would seem to be in terms of making a choice about a presidential election. And so having introduced that notion, I also want to add one other idea, and that is the idea of the Electoral College, which is something that Professor Carlisle mentioned. And she noted that the Electoral College really was a compromise that came out of the founding of the Constitution. It has existed since the framing of the Constitution, but it's only used in presidential elections. Right? So the Electoral College doesn't play a part in any other election. No election for governor, no election for a senator, no election for a member of the House of Representatives. The Electoral College is not part of any of those. And one of the things that the Electoral College does is it changes the nature of how voting occurs. So Professor Curry noted that in the United States, we tend to use plurality elections as a way to decide which candidate gets to win. So in essence, whoever gets the most votes wins that seat. There's a single winner, and it just depends on getting the most votes. That maybe you get 95% of the vote, it maybe you get 51% of the vote, or it may be you get 37% of the vote. But as long as you get the most number of votes, you're going to win that seat. Right? The Electoral College is one exception to that, because in the Electoral College, you actually have to win a majority in order to get elected as president. And the majority here is not a majority of votes, but it's in fact a majority of the Electoral College votes. And the Electoral College votes are based upon the members of the House of Representatives. So there are 435 Electoral College votes based upon the House of Representatives. There are 100 Electoral College votes based upon the members of the Senate. And then finally, there are 3 Electoral College votes which are based upon Washington, D.C., which has its own particular constitutional amendment that got those requirements. And so that means there are 538 total Electoral College votes, which means in order to get elected president, you have to win 270 of them, or you have to get a majority. So the Electoral College is the one institution that we use that actually has this majority function to it. But again, it's not a majority of votes. As we saw in 2016, right, Hillary Clinton actually won a majority of votes in among Americans, but Donald Trump got elected president because he won a majority of Electoral College votes. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Burbank. Our final topic today is about the role of race and racial inequity and the impact in US elections. Dr. Edmund Fung is joining us today to speak about this topic. Dr. Fung.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. So I have the job of talking about race. I think all of the distinguished professors prior to me have been talking about how complex and sometimes kind of irrational our American political system is. One of the things I would say that kind of seemingly clarifies, the system for Americans is often race, right? And I think we're sort of seeing that on display, leading into this election in just about a month now. That what I mean by that is, there are, clear ways in which, some of the major issues at stake, the candidates on display in this election are more easily sort of put in bite-sized form through kind of thinking about how they are shaped by, certain racial partisanship issues. And I'll just highlight a few of them, and then I want to sort of put that in historical perspective a bit. Right? And so obviously, we've been undergoing, the U.S. has been hit very hard by the, COVID pandemic. And what we've been seeing is that pandemic has really exposed racial inequities in American society that have been, developing for a long time, not just in, access to healthcare support or access for, communities of color, people of color, but also, exposing a whole range of, what, people are calling sort of lifespan, sort of racial issues around sort of life expectancy for, people of color, especially Blacks and Latinos, and how those kinds of factors, impact and make them more vulnerable to the pandemic, right? So that's one thing that's really been foregrounded this year, that exposes sort of the racial inequalities in the American system. And those are obviously one of the major features, political features, in question with this election, right? Then, of course, there's the wave of unprecedented protests around the country over the summer regarding police brutality, and the rise in support for activist groups like Black Lives Matter. This police brutality is not a new issue, certainly, but it has certainly sort of taken on a whole new life of its own this past summer. And that is forefront on the minds of many Americans as they're sort of parsing out, the two choices between the two parties in this election. And finally, of course, there is the current administration, the Trump administration, and how it has, since the beginning of Trump's election, has really sort of engaged in an explicit kind of racial partisanship lens, or a set of arguments or rhetorics, whether in the form of attacking immigrants from certain countries, or recycling sort of old racial partisanship angles, such as highlighting crime and law and order issues, which sort of implicitly frame people of color as dangerous or a threat. And so there's the rhetoric of the Trump administration itself and the partisan rhetoric of the Republican Party that is on display, right? And so in that sense, this election is, seeming to be a tremendous referendum on a whole host of kind of racial issues threaded through our two-party system and sort of partisan racial rhetoric between the two parties. And so there's kind of a stark choice that sort of often, kind of cuts through, many of the kind of arcane and complexities of our American political system. It does feel like we are heading into a historic election this fall, which will have decisive consequences on, the future of, say, racial politics, for afterwards, right? So those are on display. There are a number of other issues that have been bubbling up in recent years, somewhat lower down, sort of reform of the criminal justice system, which has been bubbling up, over the last few decades in the wake of the war on drugs, in the 1980s, that the federal government pursued, which led to mass incarceration in this country. There are issues, of course, that are impacting all of you around immigration policy, and we've sort of seen, a dramatic sort of turn away from a kind of more open door or global engagement role for the U.S., welcoming immigrants, towards a much more sort of resentful approach to, immigration policy. All of these issues are kind of racially framed in a partisan way. And they're kind of all sort of converging together in this election, at least seemingly so. So what I want to pivot away from that is just to say that, this is, even historic though it may be, this coming election, it is not novel, okay? And that's kind of what I would like to leave with all of you. Those who study racial politics in American history, often divide up American history into, what's often called racial orders, and that you can kind of periodize American history into, particular blocks of time, roughly around a generation or a bit more, where there is a particular kind of, definitional approach around racial political issues, animating the sort of partisan divide between our two parties, as Jim Curry was saying, and that there is usually a kind of major election that takes place that sort of is a sort of turning point that marks a realignment from a previous racial order into a new racial order. So the fact that it appears that race is, say, all over, this coming election in the fall is not by itself new. We have had, major elections in American history that have presented also turning points in American history. And they're not just turning points in terms of their effects on, say, racial minorities, but also in terms of how Americans think about broader policy issues, right? You know, around the state of the economy, around, you know, healthcare access, as I mentioned before, around the criminal justice system or immigration policy. That is to say that race is often a kind of tool or a means by which Americans across American history have, you know, simplified and understood, you know, sort of major policy issues that don't always specifically, you know, can't be specifically tied to any one particular racial group, right? Even though, of course, they often do pose severe policy impacts on particular racial groups. And of course, I'm thinking about things like slavery, or things like the Jim Crow era laws around segregation and disenfranchisement at the turn of the 20th century, or, you know, immigration restriction laws, you know, dating from, you say, the 1920s, that were major turning points in American history, and that would have severe impacts on, you know, communities of color. So, you know, even though I think we are rightly sort of heading into a kind of major election that will have consequences on racial politics moving forward, that we have been here before, that just goes to show that race is one of the major animating principles of American politics and American political history. It's not always the same story. Some things are recycled and repackaged into new ways. And, you know, we can't really predict how things will turn out. There are turning points. And so, yeah, that's just sort of my short little lecture to say that in some ways we are in an unprecedented election that will be decisive in many ways. But this by itself is not new when it comes to race.
Thank you, Dr. Fong. So we're now moving into the final portion of our webinar today, so we would like to answer your questions. Some of these questions were submitted in advance during the registration process, and we haven't received too many questions in the Q&A yet, so if you have any questions that you would still like to submit, please go ahead and do so in our last few minutes here. All right, so our first question is, who are the people who are elected to participate in the electoral vote? Are they honest? Who would like to take a stab at answering that question?
So are you asking here about the Electoral College? Is that what this question is about?
Yes, I believe this question is about the Electoral College and who is able to vote in the Electoral College.
Okay, so the Electoral College, again, is a unique institution in the United States. The way it works is that the Electoral College actually never meets in one place. It actually meets in all the states essentially simultaneously. So each state holds its own Electoral College election. And the way that that works is that all of the parties who are eligible on a ballot in the state are going to list as many electors as that state has. So for example, in Utah, we have 6 electoral votes. We have 4 representing our representatives, and we have 2 that represent our senators. So we have 6 Electoral College votes. That means that 6 people are chosen by the Republicans, 6 people are chosen by the Democrats, 6 people are chosen by the Constitution Party, 6 people are chosen by the Libertarian Party, etc. In the event that that party wins the state, then those are the people who get to vote. And so the question is, are they trustworthy people? Well, generally the reason that they're chosen is because the parties trust them to do what they're supposed to do, which is to say, vote for the candidate that won the popular vote. So for example, in Utah, if the Republican Party were to win the state of Utah, that the people who generally show up at the Electoral College, just about anybody is eligible. The only people who aren't eligible to be in the Electoral College are sitting members of Congress in the House or the Senate. But generally speaking, they're almost always previous elected officials, or again, people who are closely connected to the political party. So often people like former governors, people like former senators, people like the leader of a state party right? So those are the people who are often chosen in the Electoral College. And again, why are they chosen? They're chosen because the party is counting on them to do what they're supposed to do, which is to vote for the candidate that they're supposed to vote for. In almost all cases, they do exactly that. There have been a few cases in the United States where those electors make some other decision, but it's never changed the outcome of an election.
Right. Our next question is, can you explain why the recent death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has become so influential in this election? How is the Supreme Court involved in the election? I thought they were independent of the legislative branch.
Do you want me to take that?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so the first part of the question is, why is Ruth Bader Ginsburg so influential, or why? Can you just repeat it again? Sorry, this is the first part.
No problem. Can you explain why the recent death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg has become so influential in this election?
Yeah. So the reason why the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg has become so important is for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that if the president gets to nominate the next judicial Supreme Court member, and so he will identify, and he has identified, Amy Coney Barrett as the replacement. And then the Senate will vote to approve that nominee. And the real issue here is Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of the most liberal members of the court. One of her strongest legacies is equality. And she fought not only for gender equality on behalf of women, but gender equality on behalf of men. She also championed racial equality. So equality across the board. So for Trump to have the ability to nominate somebody and have the Republican Senate basically rubber stamp that means you would be substituting a conservative member for a liberal member. And what this means is that'll change the balance of the court dramatically. The balance of the court is usually about 4-5 on really political issues, strongly salient and political issues. Sometimes the Chief Justice will side one way or the other, but with an appointment of somebody like Amy Coney Barrett, it will put the balance of power very much so on the conservative side. So we'd have like a 6-3 court essentially on some of these more contested issues. And we could talk about what this means, especially in the case that Republicans overall, haven't won their seats by a majority of votes. So Democrats get a lot more votes, and also, and so that would really tip the balance and not really represent, I guess, Americans' preference. It would represent, the court would represent a minority preference. And then number two, one of the big issues is because in 2016, about 10 months before the 2016 election, Justice Scalia passed away, and Barack Obama had nominated Merrick Garland. And one of the issues was that the Republicans, again, who had majority in the Senate, Mitch McConnell and his colleagues, had said, well, because we have an upcoming election, we should let the voters decide. And so we're not going to move on this nominee. With the election on the horizon, it would be unfair to the American people. If the shoe was on the other foot, say in 2020, and a justice dies 10 months or 9 months or 8 months before the election, we would do the same thing and leave that seat open. But one of Mitch McConnell's biggest legacies is to create a conservative court. And so not only are they pushing ahead with, trying to vote on this nominee, but they're doing so during an election. So it's not even before an election, it's during an election. So although the court is, we like to think of it as apolitical, it is an extraordinarily politically characterized branch of the US government, just seen in different ways. You have to look at it very differently.
I'd like to say a little something also. I think sort of connecting up with what I was, sort of trying to get at in my other remarks. If we look at it sort of from, I was talking about, racial orders and sort of grouping American politics into different eras. And from my corner of, political science, we often sort of see, the last 50 years as a post-civil rights era, right? Where there's a certain sort of consensus around, civil rights issues that date from landmark laws and actions during the 1960s, right? And so in that sense, RBG is kind of a hallmark of a sort of founding figure or pillar of that sort of post-civil rights era, right? One of the Supreme Court played a major role in, in inaugurating in the civil rights era and its aftermath, through, expanding the Civil Rights Act to, include women and other sort of marginalized groups, to, find a right to privacy with abortion rights. And, RBG had, a historic record in sort of pushing through, that sort of mindset and in the Supreme Court. And so as, Juliet was saying, that sort of balance of power or consensus with the Supreme Court has been kind of being eroded, over time. And so, she is one of the last kind of holdovers of that. And with her passage and replacement with a conservative, the fear is that it would really sort of tip the balance, and you could see a whole host of laws or approaches to, say, civil rights or equality that could be subject to, redefinition, moving forward. And so in that historic sense, yeah, that's what I would say or add, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passage is very important.
All right, we are just nearly out of time today, but we do have one more question that was submitted through the Q&A. This isn't, if you want to take a chance at answering this question in just these last few minutes, but the question is, historically, how important are presidential debates in influencing the results of the election?
Matt, you want to answer that? Oh, he's muted. There we go.
Just going to say, I'll let you answer that one, Juliet. I'm sorry.
You want me to do that one? Okay.
Yeah.
So Matt and I just did a webinar on this, and University of Utah, I don't know if they posted it yet, but it was supposed to be posted on social media. There's also an article that we participated in. And so one of the things about presidential debates is that by the time they roll around, most of us who are going to vote have already made up our minds who we're going to vote for. And that decision is largely determined by our partisan identification. So those who are Democrats have long known that they're going to vote for Biden. Those who are Republicans have long known that they're going to vote for Trump. And this election is a little bit different. There's probably some Republicans who know that they're not going to vote for Trump, but they know that they're going to vote for perhaps Biden. So in a large part, the influence of debates, especially presidential or vice presidential debates, is fairly limited. So candidates might get a little bump that's temporary, but it's not enough to really shake the election one way or the other. A candidate might sort of stumble a little bit, but it's usually not enough to say, oh my gosh, he's the worst candidate, I can't vote for him anymore. In a lot of ways, the debate sort of can mirror what's going on in the election environment anyway. So the fact that maybe Trump, by a lot of media accounts, didn't do very well in the last debate was, could have influenced people, but it's not to say that a lot of other things haven't influenced how they would vote. So if people didn't like the way Trump behaved in the debate, they also might not like the way that he didn't pay taxes, or that he has responded to COVID, or, name any sort of other issue that he's got sort of brewing around him. So there's a lot of things that in the campaign environment might influence people more than a debate. So there's pretty much little influence. Some things that the debate will do is maybe get people fired up and mobilized. So it's sort of like a pep rally, if you will. It's sort of like the convention. It gets people really excited about their candidate. For some people who are tuning in late to the election, unlike probably Matt, Edmund, and I, and Jim Curry, we've probably been following the election probably for a couple of years now, since candidates started to identify themselves as candidates, because that's what we sort of breathe, eat, and sleep is political science. And so for us, there's probably not a lot of influences, but people who are just waking up and like, oh, there's an election, there could be an influence, but also these people might not likely turn out to vote. So for voters, there's probably little influence. I don't know if Matt or Edmund want to add anything to that.
No, yeah, I mean, it's mostly political theater. I mean, and I think, what Juliet said, especially I think around how it can motivate people who are already leaning one way or another. I mean, that can sort of have a minor effect. So, yeah, but in the larger scheme of things, yeah, I mean, the election is usually, I was trying to think about historic elections in the past where debates really played a role. And, classic example, I think, is 1960 with the JFK, right? First televised presidential debate.
Yeah, and that really came down to, Edmund, if I recall, how people viewed the debate or participated, whether they watched it on TV or listened to it on the radio.
Yeah.
People who listened to it on the radio thought Nixon won. People who watched it on TV thought Kennedy won because he was so much more handsome, and Nixon had looked disheveled and sweaty and 5 o'clock shadow.
Yeah, we all know the lore.
Yeah, I think Matt had an example of one of Obama's debate, and then there's an example of Carter, but there were so many other things going on during Carter's election that sort of already jeopardized his, sort of standing anyway.
Yeah, I will just note that it's not that debates can't have an impact. They can, but they just often don't, for the very reasons that Juliet pointed out, right? Is that very often what's happening is that people look at the debates in terms of the views that they've already thought about and considered. And so as a result of that, it doesn't tend to change very many people's minds, but it can impact the dynamic of the election on occasion in the nature of how the candidates and the campaigns try to take advantage of a good or a bad performance in a debate.
All right, I hate to cut off the discussion, but we are out of time for today. So this will conclude our first session on the basics of the US political system. I would like to sincerely thank all of our expert panelists for joining us today and providing their perspective and expertise on these topics. Our next session will be held next Tuesday, October 13th, again at 4 p.m. The focus will be on international student rights and responsibilities when engaging in the US political process and political activism. And we look forward to having all of you join us. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.